You know, there are so many problems in the Arab world today. Look at the meltdown in Iraq, despite all the oil gurgling under the surface. Look at what's happening with the sham presidential elections in Syria, or perhaps even the dizzying corruption and the inertia in Lebanon. What about Libya? What about Yemen? So many countries with so many problems. And yet, today I would like to focus on Israel Palestine again, and on a ceasefire that just kicked in last night, pretty much at midnight local time, after 11 violent and bloody days of an asymmetric war that pitted Palestinian factions in Gaza against the military behemoth of Israel, and resulted, sadly, in 232 Palestinian deaths and equally sadly, 12 Israeli deaths. So why, again, Israel-Palestine today? Well, because to be honest with you, it's the most topical issue, but then you might turn around and tell me, yes, but you've already done 2 YouTube episodes on it. You've already done a 1-hour whopping episode with James Abbott for Middle East analysis. What is it that you have to bring into the discussion at this stage? You might well be right, but I think that this ceasefire is an occasion, an opportunity to think a little bit beyond the confrontations, beyond the violence, and project once more, not so much outside the box, well inside the box if you wish, but to project a bit more about what could happen in the future. After all, those 11 days have been sobering days. They've been sobering for Palestinians, they've been sobering for Israelis, and they've been sobering also for many other parts of the world. So welcome to Intuitive Reactions, the MENA and Gulf regions. This is my number 30. Now the war was happening, the rockets and the bombing and the collapsing towers were daily events for us, when we saw that the Europeans were desperately trying to have a say in the outcome of this war, in a ceasefire that they wanted to see happen. The French were working hard at it. We saw the German, Czech, and Slovak ministers visiting Israel. We saw expressions of support for Israel. We saw understanding for Palestinians, but it wasn't really shifting yet. There was even the progressive wing of the United States Democratic Party, which was expressing its displeasure with the Biden policy and the US stated policy of firm support for Israel, come what may. And there were demonstrations galore, some of them allowed and some of them not allowed, in many parts of the world, including the Arab world and including Europe. And then, of course, one of the visible consequences of those 11 days were that some parties were sidelined. Ramallah was pretty much sidelined. Gaza came to the forefront, and people started saying, what next? So if I want to start with 3 basic statements, I would say the following. As a consequence of those 11 days, Jerusalem was reinserted into the political map. The Palestinian conflict itself came back and became prominent. And attempts at marginalization of the Palestinian conflict, the Palestinian cause, the cause of Jerusalem, the cause of the West Bank, of Gaza, of Palestinian Arabs in Israel itself, all this came to prominence. But these are basic conclusions that you and I know and knew a few days ago already, even before the ceasefire kicked in. Also quite clear was that any attempt to unseat caretaker Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel collapsed, because some of the parties which were flirting with the idea of an alternative government withdrew their support for any such project. And therefore, what could happen now is that Prime Minister Netanyahu would stay there until a fifth parliamentary election in Israel, probably sometime in late autumn. But if all this is basic, and if we know the support systems across the world for one party or the other, if we know of the popular response to the violence that took place in 2021, can we use the outcome of this latest 11-day war? Can we use it in order to come out of this vicious cycle, a vicious cycle that is war, ceasefire, war again, with all the destruction, the loss of lives, the fear? Can we do that? History reminds us that this has been the reality for many, many years. Look at 2008, 2009. Look at 2012. Look at 2014. Will 2021 be the same thing? We'll have a ceasefire largely mediated by Egypt, although many other countries were working in the background, Jordan, Qatar, others. Would this just be a quiet for quiet ceasefire, or will it help usher in something new? Facts on the ground have changed. I told you about those basic realities that had been forgotten for a number of years, not least because of the presidency of Donald Trump, not least because of the Abraham Accords, not least because of all the gossip and speculation and narratives of a deal of a century. All that has come back. Why? Because the Palestinian cause instinctively evokes a reaction across many of the Arab and Muslim worlds. And now the world, the United States, Europe, even Israel, have been reminded once again that you cannot really have peace in this region if you do not do something about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the injustice that has been heaped upon Palestinians, be they Christian or Muslim, for so many long decades. So the question is, at the moment, some people are still talking about a two-state solution. Others are now saying that's gone. We should focus on a one-state or binational solution. Others are saying even that will not work. I cannot imagine the settlers and the religious zealots in Israel accepting a one-state solution, let alone, for that matter, a two-state solution. And we've seen the havoc that settlers and religious zealots, some of whom are in the parliament, in the Knesset, upon the behest and invitation of Prime Minister Netanyahu. So if that is not working and the other is not working as well, could it be that we're talking about a rights-based discourse now? This is not really new. I used to hear this many years ago in legal agoras and legal meetings, conferences, but it was never really the focus because everybody was so fixated on the two-state solution. Carnegie Endowment, Carnegie Middle East Center has talked about a rights-based discourse to get us out of this pit. Would that be the option now? But in order for any option to work, be that two-state, one-state, rights-based discourse, quiet for quiet, what we also need to know, and I think 2021, those 11 days have taught us that we need not only the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah to talk, but also Hamas and other Palestinian factions in Gaza to talk. Until now, it's been a very interesting symmetry there. The Palestinians in Ramallah, President Mahmoud Abbas and the Fatah movement have been responsible for negotiations, whether regional or international, whereas Hamas and some other factions have focused on the process of liberation and resistance. Is it not possible now that Hamas has burnished its credentials, has shown that it can fight for Jerusalem, for Al-Aqsa, for the rights of all Palestinians, not only for Gaza? Is there any way of bringing them in from the cold and involving them in a peace process? After all, if the problem are the Americans or some of the Europeans, haven't they been talking with the Houthis in Yemen? Haven't they been talking even more officially with the Taliban in Afghanistan? Is it not possible to also address Hamas as one of the components of the Palestinian conflict? The Palestinian people are one. It is their political factions that divide them. And this has been made manifest during all those episodes of belligerence and war that I've just stated. Is that possible? Because at the end, at the very end of all of this, what is clear to me is something that Professor Khaled Fahmy, a historian at Cambridge University, said a few days ago. And it stuck in my mind because, not because it was an earth-shattering revelation, far from it, but because it is so true. He said, the problem is neither this nor that. The problem is occupation. The occupation of one people, the occupation of their lands, and the occupation of their national rights. If we address that occupation, and if we grow up to be bold enough to say enough is enough, no more violation of rights, no more spoliation of lands, no more apartheid, no more violence, no more settlers rampaging in Palestinian territories, but also security for Israel, something that Israelis felt very much from Ashkelon to Beersheba to Tel Aviv to elsewhere during those 11 days. If we can bring those two together, and if we can bring in all the factions to speak together, would that not be an attempt at finding an ironic solution to a conflict that has lasted so many decades? I cannot guarantee that it will work. It probably will not work. But isn't it better to try and fail rather than not try at all? Is it not in the interest of everyone? World peace, regional peace, and the peace for Palestinians and Israelis to do that? Think of that. Overcome your steroidal biases and think of both peoples as human beings who deserve quiet, peace, and prosperity for the future. Take care. I'll keep my fingers crossed. That's all I can do. Have a nice weekend.